Good evening. Although I have to tell you, I'm recording this, it's morning, but ours is an evening class, so hey, good evening, I'll have to work. One of the reasons that I'm recording this, the primary reason, is because I want to make sure that no one misses it. And the secondary reason is there's some parts of it, like the basic coping with graphs, that I want you to be able to go back to as you discover that you are struggling with the abstract reasoning and modeling that we use quite a bit in this course. And so that part will be at the end of this first video. You'll be able to go back to it whenever you want to. All right, so this is environmental and natural resource economics. And a very useful translation of that is that it's price theory applied to natural resource and environmental scarcities. All right, that's the basis of economics is, hey, there's not enough of everything. There's not enough of the things we value the most. They have a lot of different uses. And so when we choose one use over another, we incur opportunity costs and there are trade-offs. And off we go with our economic tools and how we resolve those to achieve an efficient outcome. And efficiency is not everything, but then once we have the most efficient outcome, then we know what the price tag is for all the other ways that we might manage the resource, our environment, that might forego some efficiency in the name of some other benefit, equity, freedom, redistribution, whatever. We have a price tag then, and we can make an intelligent choice about whether the improvement in these non-efficiency areas is worth the loss in terms of efficiency. All right, so just kind of a reminder to you, which most of you are economics majors, but in case you're not, a reminder that economics is a decision-making science. It's about what constitutes rational decision-making. So at times we encounter irrational decision-making, and we just have to throw up our hands and say, well, economics is not going to help us understand irrational decision-making. Okay, so efficiency is the main issue that we focus upon. And for efficiency, we have to first outline the choices in terms of which tool we might use, right, to improve or better manage, in this case, subject of our course is environment and natural resources. And once we lay out the different tools, then we have to ask the ever-present, okay, how much of these tools do we apply? How hard do we lean on these different levers to make improvements, but at a cost? And then we have to do the old two-handed economist thing and say, okay, up to this point, the benefits of leaning a little harder is worth the costs of foregoing other benefits, other uses of resources. And by the way, one of the more important things in this course is the fact that that varies by perspective. In other words, the individual doing this and weighing his or her benefits as they change with quantity, marginal benefits, versus costs as they change with quantity, marginal costs. That can vary for the individual, what they would choose to do, and then aggregated across all individuals, what the equilibrium outcome can be, can quite often, not nearly even a large share of the time, but still quite often, especially in environmental and natural resource decision-making arenas, can yield a different outcome than that which would seem like the social optimum. So you may be used to thinking in terms of marginal benefit versus marginal cost from your other economics courses. Well, in this economics course, we often have to distinguish between marginal social cost and marginal private cost. Differences between those two is the essence of the pollution problems that we will study. There's also, at times, differences between marginal social benefit and marginal private benefit. Because of those differences, equilibrium outcomes, the sum total result of people pursuing their self-interest, can differ from the social optimum that would result if all of us sort of collectively decided in a perfect arena, which means not our political arenas, but that's where we make those choices. So sometimes the political arenas produce worse outcomes than the equilibrium. Hopefully we choose wisely and we only try to improve upon things where the political process is likely to yield improvements. All right, backing away from some of that a little bit, let me just introduce myself. I am indeed Dr. Merrifield, Dr. John Merrifield. So make sure you clicked on the right course. You probably did. But that formality, well, it's useful for my paycheck, and it's useful for you to recognize that I am a full-time faculty member, and I have an office here. I'm there all the time, and I have an @utsa.edu email, and I monitor it regularly. All those things are important. But the bottom line is I'm just a regular person that knows a little bit about some things, a little bit more about some things than you do. And so we can interact on an informal basis, and I can appreciate the fact that a lot of things, you know more about them than I do. So feel free to call me by my first name, or if that feels a little bit risque, it's not, but if it feels a little bit risque, call me Doc. That's kind of my preference. So again, I urge you to be in contact through our discussion forums. I'm an email slave. I answer those immediately when I see them, which is often right after you send them. I have office hours, but the official office hours are not nearly all the times when I'm there. If those office hours are not convenient for you, tell me. We'll find a different time to meet. I'm here to serve, and that's part of one of my key guiding principles. Actually, several of them, now that I think about it. Let me just list those, what they are. Truth and labeling. Right? So in other words, I like to call things what they are and not just kind of paper over what they really are to try to be politically correct. We can have direct communication and sometimes agree to disagree and not get our feelings hurt. All right, so guiding principle number 1 is truth and labeling. Another guiding principle related to what I just said is I try to make a positive difference whenever I am anywhere or doing anything. Okay, that's just part of my wiring. I guess my parents did a good job of raising me, because that's what I think about a lot. And so that's part of why I try to be regularly available in all of the electronic forums and come to my office to meet you if you want to meet me at a time that's different than when I'm there automatically in my official office hours. And last but not least, something that some of you might think is an attempt at humor, guiding principle number 3 is that the fun never ends unless you let it. And you think, well, this is serious business. And indeed, serious academics. But we can do serious academics with a sense of humor, and I would argue that when we do, we achieve more of the serious academics than if we just drone on and we try to act really, really serious all the time. People kind of fade out and tune out, which, by the way, is another reason to have this video, is in case you find yourself doing that, you can say, yeah, I just kind of distracted myself, or I tried to do some multitasking because it was on my computer and I didn't listen carefully enough. But by golly, it's on a video. I can go back to it and listen to it again. So there you go. A way out of some of the downsides of the bad habits that we acquire. All right. So on to some of the fundamentals that will guide us throughout this study of natural resource and environmental economics. First of all, we might ask, well, what's so special, what's different about environmental scarcities or natural resource scarcities that warrants having a special course? Why can't this just be one of the many things that are covered in just generic economics courses? What's so different or special about environmental and natural resource issues? Well, one of the things that makes it indeed worthy and appropriate to have a separate course is that environmental and natural resource economics often deals in very hard to value factors. What do we mean by value? Well, our common denominator of value is the almighty dollar. So sometimes it's hard to put benefits and costs into dollar terms, especially on the benefit side. And by the way, it's important to understand that when we use the term benefit, we mean any impact caused by the decision that we're considering, and so that means it's possible to have negative benefits. We want to relegate the term cost or opportunity cost to just the administration in case of a rule that we're talking about, the administration of the rule and the compliance cost of complying with it, right? Whereas the impacts of complying with the rule, like fewer emissions, but maybe on the downside, the emissions have been changed from gas coming out of a smokestack into a sludge that we dump into the landfill. you know, we have to net out the benefits of transforming the emissions from a gas into some gunk that we deposited, right? Because both of them have to be dumped somewhere, which has a cost to the environment. Hopefully, the transformation reduces the cost to the environment. All right, so we have a lot of hard-to-value factors, which makes it challenging to have a benefit-cost analysis of some of the policies and projects that we might consider to manage or enhance the environment or more intelligently use our natural resources. So what do we mean by hard-to-value factors? For example, one of the issues that comes up is prolonging or shortening the average lifespan. Yeah, sure. If we reduce emissions, some people will live longer than they otherwise would have. If we reduce the emissions of some crud, the air will be cleaner, okay, and it'll be easier to see further, and that's good. Improve visibility, improve aesthetics. That's worth something, but it's hard to put a dollar sign on it, and it's hard to put a dollar sign on incremental changes in aesthetics. We might say that it's worth X dollars to go from here to here and have two different pictures, and one looks kind of foggy and the other one looks as clear as a bell. But what's the incremental effect of moving gradually from this kind of cruddy looking status quo to this absolutely pristine, perhaps unrealistic outcome? Maybe somewhere in between is the optimum, where the additional benefits are just barely worth the additional costs, and we say that's as far as we want to go. Sure, it would be nice to have it be utterly, totally, sparklingly clean, but that last little bit of ultra clean, sparkly isn't worth the very high costs of getting there. And by the way, as you probably might be thinking, that's one of the reasons that people don't like economists, is they tell people about these stark realities that having things be perfect costs an awful lot more than having them be not quite perfect, but pretty close. People don't want to hear those kinds of things. They want the air to be totally pristine, the water to be totally clear, to have absolutely nothing in it. They don't want to be told, leave a few contaminants in there, not enough, people won't notice it or hardly notice it. And it'll sure save a lot of money and other costs to allow it to be in there. All right, anyway, so back to this hard-to-value thing. There are often recreational uses and values, and some of those recreational uses are, hey, I may someday want to go visit a national park, to see this wilderness area, but I may never get a chance to. In the meantime, I'd like to have some willingness to pay. It's worth something for it to be left in its natural state or something pretty close. After all, I'd like to be able to go in there. I need a trail to walk on, so it's not going to be absolutely pristine. Somebody's got to go in there and construct a walkable trail if I'm to be able to enjoy this natural resource called a wilderness area. Another issue that's special or somewhat special to environmental and natural resource issues is that the political process maybe will have to modify property rights, institutions, in order to provide for better outcomes than the ones we've been getting. That's not a normal thing that we consider as part of normal economics courses. And then related to that, we better understand the behavior of government officials. What's likely to stop them from making important changes in the rules of the game? What likely changes in the rules of the game are they going to prefer? Said the word likely a couple times. What changes in the rules of the game are they most likely to prefer, and why? Maybe those aren't the most efficient rules, but for whatever reason, the most efficient change in rules isn't politically correct. Well, what changes in rules that are as efficient as possible are politically correct? Those are important parts of resolving environmental and natural resource opportunities to increase efficiency. Part of the problem in natural resource issues and the reasons that politicians sometimes need to ponder changes in property rights is that many practices that becoming entrenched traditions evolved before there was any real scarcity. Here in San Antonio, Texas, where I'm standing right now, recording this video, we have our Edwards Aquifer, which is our deep underground, massive source of water upon which we're heavily dependent. We use other water sources now, but that's still our largest one. It gets about 500,000 acre-feet of water. That's enough water to cover an acre a foot deep in terms of additional of inflow every year, on an average year. For years, that was more than enough to cover how much water we wanted to extract from it. So the water itself wasn't scarce. The only thing that was scarce was that it cost money to pump the water out of there and just deliver it to people's homes. But now that we've had a lot of economic growth and there's a lot more of us in the area, the water itself is scarce. We know that if we pump a lot more in one time period, that may cause us to have to pump a lot less in future time periods. That may not be acceptable. We now have to balance uses in the present versus uses in the future. So that means that the rules that evolved before the Edwards Aquifer of San Antonio, Texas, was scarce, are suddenly no longer appropriate, so no longer efficient. They used to be perfect. It used to be unlimited pumping was exactly the right rule to have. It no longer is. So now the politicians are confronted with a need, an imperative, a please change something to make it more efficient, more sustainable, in a rule that's become deeply ingrained in the way people do business. It's tough. It's tough. Okay, so traditional rules and practices go from perfect to problematic. In the environmental sphere, emissions that had been inconsequential, and in many places still are inconsequential. Take, for example, Wyoming, the state where I earned my PhD. There are only 500,000 people that live in that very windy state. Emissions there from automobiles, even in the most densely populated parts of the state, Casper, Wyoming, and Cheyenne, Wyoming, have about 50 to 60 to 70,000 people. I haven't checked lately. They may have grown some. But it's windy there, and really the emissions of automobiles or even factories, unless you're right there by the tailpipe or by the smokestack, no consequence. The environmental's ability to process waste in Wyoming is not a scarce resource. It is not yet subject to scarcity. But in Los Angeles, California, or San Antonio, Texas, or Dallas, Texas, or Houston, Texas, or most any not so windy, much more densely populated, hotter place, the environment's ability to process waste is indeed scarce. We have to limit use of that scarce resource, limit emissions to manage pollution problems and to keep them within a manageable, okay level. You might say, well, why don't we get rid of them? Well, we're back to that trade-off thing of marginal benefits versus costs. Reducing emissions up to a point creates more benefits than costs. But unfortunately, for those of us who would like it to all be pristine, beyond a certain point, additional emission reduction, we usually call it abatement, is not worth the opportunity cost of going further, which means we're going to have to tolerate, in the name of efficiency, some damage. And let me back up a little bit and define some things that we're going to need to understand throughout the semester. Emissions are not necessarily pollution. Yeah. Until damages are caused. And by damages, that's a pretty loosely defined term, or it can be. You know, obviously damage can be a gag, cough, it's hard to breathe. Yes, those are damages. But what if I used to be able to see 20 miles on a nice day, you know, good weather. Now, because of emissions, I can only see 5 miles. Okay, is that a damage? Well, there's a willingness to pay for the 20 miles versus the 5 miles. So, yeah, that fits within our loose definition of damages. But we can also think in terms of damages being things like people will live as long, okay, on average. Some people will live just as long as always. They've got iron plated lungs. You know, we're all different, but other people are very sensitive to, and even a little bit of increase in emissions, and suddenly they'll be gagging and coughing, and their lives may be shortened. Okay, so emissions become pollution once damages begin to be imposed on some members of the population, which can be indirect. Maybe the damages aren't directly on people, but maybe it's hurting plants and animals, but because people value plants and animals and value them in the sense that they deserve to live comfortably in their own right. You know, they value that, and so those are damages. All right, so emissions become pollution when there are damages, but that's not necessarily a pollution problem. Okay? Pollution problems means uncompensated damages. Let's try to get a handle on that we can relate to. By the way, what's a good example that you made? Let me just back up a little bit of emissions either not being pollution or being pollution. Yeah, we can think in terms of air pollution and, you know, Wyoming versus Houston and Dallas and San Antonio and Los Angeles, California. Yeah. But suppose, I'm recording this during the summer, by the way. Suppose you go down to the local swimming pool. Let's hope it's a big swimming pool. You know, there's going to be some people that have some accidental discharge in the swimming pool. Let's hope it's not too many, right? If it's just a few, you know, it's a big swimming pool. Dilution is the solution to pollution. You know, not enough emissions to cause any noticeable change in the quality of the water. It's got chlorine in it, you know. So, okay, so the emissions are not yet pollution problem. Most of the people are jumping out of the pool to use the toilet when they feel the need, and only a few are saying, you know, nobody will notice. I'll just lose it in the water. But what if everybody takes that attitude, and it's a really hot summer day, and it's a really crowded day at the pool, and nobody bothers to hop out and use the toilet, and they just you know, into the water. Well, you know, that might be enough to cause that water, you know, to suddenly have a little yellow tinge, or, you know, you can kind of smell it a little bit, and okay, emissions are now pollution. All right, so pollution, back to the pollution versus pollution problem. What's a easy, though maybe kind of silly example to help understand the difference between just pollution and a pollution problem? All right, so suppose somebody dumps a bag of trash in my lawn every day. Not just a bag where the trash stays in it, but the bag hits my lawn, trash all over the place. You know, that's pollution. You know, that's at that point, it's uncompensated damage, right? But what, you know, and here's where the example gets a little silly. What if they leave $20 in my mailbox at the same time? You know, they're just too lazy to take the trash wherever. It's just so convenient to dump it in my lawn, but they don't want to make me mad. Okay, so they dump the trash, throw it on my lawn, and they slip a $20 bill in my mailbox. You know, every day I come out and see the trash. I'm thinking, but wait a minute, it might be $20 in my mailbox. Sure enough, there it is again. I do the math. 20 times 365, my goodness, that's over $7,000 a year. You know, I think that's compensated damage. That's not a pollution, that's pollution. There it is, it's ugly on my lawn. But for 20 times, whatever the math is there, times 365, over $7,000, you know, I think I can have the neighborhood kid, maybe my own kid, earn part of his allowance, clean that up every day, and have some money left over to, you know, to have a good time or just to add to my savings account. All right, so pollution problems can be alleviated in one of two ways or a combination of two ways. If the definition of pollution is that it's uncompensated damage, then we can eliminate pollution problems through some combination of compensation and damage reduction, typically emission reduction, or changing the emissions into some other form, like converting the gas to some kind of sludge through a technology that you might stick on a smokestack. All right, and we're not done yet. Emissions, pollution problem, policy relevant pollution problem. All right? So, yeah, there are cases of uncompensated damages that are just not worth doing anything about. You know, it takes some effort and time and risk of loss of freedom to turn a government agency, to create a government agency or expand the powers of an existing government agency to address a pollution problem. And let me just kind of go on a little tangent for a second. Most pollution problems result from one of two things, and especially the first, namely poorly defined or unenforced property rights. You might think, wait a minute, I thought most pollution problems were the result of greedy corporations. Well, that might be the reason. That might be the reason that the unenforced, poorly defined property rights are a reason for the environmental degradation, for a pollution problem. For example, if the environment's ability to process waste is unowned and unpriced, the greedy corporations will see that as a free place to dump their wastes, and free is better than packaging up their gunk into some other way to dispose of it. It's nicer, but they have to pay for it, right? They're in a competitive market. They've got to keep their prices down, so it may make sense to them from just a survival perspective, never mind that, sure, they're probably greedy, to go with that really cheap, maybe free, unowned and unpriced air to dump their wastes through a big old smokestack. All right, so pollution problems are not always policy relevant because of the cost of the machinery to do something about them, right? So it's one of life's unfortunate realities is some problems are better left out there. Yes, annoying, problematic, not fair, but to do something about them is even more costly, maybe risky. Government agencies have a way of creating and writing rules and may make things worse rather than better. Right? Therein lies some risk. And let me give you an example of that. Let's say you get in a crowded elevator and somebody had a few too many beans with lunch. Right? So it's early afternoon. And you're going up 10 or 15 floors, and it's kind of hard to get out of the elevator, and all of a sudden, you know, that loud noise that you recognize. Whew. Wow. You know, man, that's bad. I'm telling you, that's pollution. At least for a couple minutes till you get to your floor, or somehow you leave before the door opens, and you leave before your floor comes up. We're talking definitely uncompensated damage. Now, is that enough of a problem often enough and, with serious health consequences other than, oh, wow, it just stinks really bad for a couple seconds until you can get out of the elevator? Is that a bad enough problem to create a government agency or to tell Congress to create a bean tax so not as many people have as many beans with lunch and so not as much flatulence to impact unwary elevator riders? I kind of doubt it. I don't think that rises to the threshold of we need more rules and more bureaucrats or higher taxes on something. Maybe you disagree, and that's the coin of the realm. That's one of the reasons that we're here, is to have intelligent grounds for disagreement and not disagree over things that are settled empirically and objectively. And let's leave the disagreements for differences in how we value things, which is definitely legitimate grounds. We can all be equally informed about something and know all the economics and still say, I agree with all of those empirical findings and all the positive economics, but I don't agree with what we should do about it. Fine. All right, let me find my place in my notes here and continue for a little bit longer. Okay, so one of the things that we, got them out of order. No wonder my brain is scrambled. Okay, so some more examples on why we have some unique issues that justify a special course in environmental and natural resource economics. So far, what we've discussed are things in the environmental realm, pretty much. Although, the notion of natural resource versus economics is kind of a fuzzy difference, because the environment, its ability to process waste, its existence as a source of raw materials, but then we lose some environmental characteristics if we create a mine and start digging stuff up or cutting down trees for wood. There's sort of a fuzzy distinction. But let's move into some of the things that are a little bit more obviously on the natural resource side. What if we have a situation where, say, the harvesting, killing, taking of an animal species for economic benefit is for a long period sustainable? In other words, the amount of animals is taken for use by people, say the American Indians taking buffalo for use by the Indian tribe was sustainable for long periods of time. I mean, there were gazillions of buffalo roaming the plains into the early 1800s when the white settlers from Europe and other places in the world, from the West Coast, from Asia, started arriving. And at that point, because of poorly defined property rights and because of growing numbers of people, we had a situation where the rules of the game went from perfect. What were the rules of the game? If there's a buffalo and you can put an arrow in it or put a bullet in it and stop it, the pelt and the meat and all of that's yours to use as you see fit. You know, that went from the perfect way to regulate use of that natural resource for human benefit to we're going to cause the extinction of these buffalo, and we nearly did, until there were some private ranches created out of the Great Plains Commons, as it's called, a vast expanse of land where everybody had open access to the buffalo. So we had some ranches and natural parks created in that vast, commonly owned expanse called the U.S., or more properly, the North American Great Plains. Buffalo went to very small numbers very fast and were bordering on extinction. All right, so species extinctions can be rather drastic effects of sudden inappropriateness of things that used to be just perfect rules of the game. Groundwater depletion, you may have read about this. What do I mean by groundwater depletion? Well, you know, it's bad enough that it's harder to pump the water in the ground and maybe you have to use other water. But on top of that, now we've got sinkholes and highways and people's homes and buildings are falling into these giant holes. So that may be a reason to suddenly change the rules of the game from what had been okay and perfect for a long period of time. Maybe we better regulate the pumping of groundwater where we didn't before. Because maybe now people are taking more groundwater than we can sustainably tolerate, and without getting these sinkholes and depletion of the groundwater resource. What about surface water depletion? You know, if we say, you know, if you live next to a lake or a river, you can divert as much water as you want. You know, that used to be the rules of the game. It still is in many places. In many places, it still works fine. Not appropriate anymore in some places. Because not only is there depletion of the groundwater, but there's these indirect effects that we regret, namely wildlife loss, recreation loss. You know, people used to like to raft on the river. Now where's the river? We're taking too much water out of there for irrigation, a valuable use, for homes, for bathing and cooking, valuable uses, but recreation was a valuable use too. How do we resolve those two? Marginal benefit versus marginal cost. What's the magic quantity under varying circumstances? It rains more in some years than others, of allocation of that scarce surface water to these competing uses. Environmental impacts, we've discussed those already. Sometimes natural resource use has an environmental impact. You know, if we cut down too many trees and then there's heavy rain, all the water floods, we get floods where we otherwise might not. A lot of the soil washes away. And now the trees won't even grow back. Okay, so we have some aesthetic impacts, pollution problems that would not have otherwise existed and had not previously existed. And later in the course, we'll talk about fishing. Many places, fishing is the dominant industry of a lot of coastal cities, villages mostly. When there's overfishing, suddenly it's harder to find fish. The whole community collapses. So we have impacts that become not just, well, the fish are more expensive, now the whole community is collapsed. So these are all things that come up in the management of natural resources and how to decide what's efficient or what's close to efficient, but enough better in some other dimension like equity that a little bit of efficiency loss is worth tolerating. And as I've been sort of hinting at, but I want to make it a little bit more explicit along the way, not only do we want to know what the costs and benefits are of discrete choices, okay, but we want to know what the change in the costs and the benefits are between the discrete choices. As I mentioned a little earlier, the changes from, hey, the air looks really bad, It's really hard to see. It's really kind of fuzzy out there. If you've ever visited the Grand Canyon, you may have experienced this. You came to the Grand Canyon for some great views. You stepped to the edge of the Grand Canyon and it was like, where is it? I see the edge. I don't want to walk there. I'll fall off and I'll die. I thought there was a river down there. Yeah, there is, according to my brochure from the park. Yeah, the Colorado River. I don't see it. Why not? Well, there's a power plant just northeast of the river. I'm sorry, just northeast of the park. If the wind blows in a certain direction, it's a coal-fired power plant. That smoke, the emissions coming out of that smokestack, will get in there and make you say, why did I travel all the way from the East Coast for this view of the Grand Canyon? And then it's, would you be willing to pay for fewer unsightly emissions from that power plant? And you think, that'll make electricity cost more. Up to a point, yeah. I'd pay a little bit more for electricity, this much more, if I could have a nice pristine view of the Colorado River today, all day today, during my visit. Would you pay twice as much for electricity? No. Okay, so somewhere in there, you're doing marginal analysis and you're saying up to a point, yeah, I'm willing to pay a little bit more for the production of electricity if for that I get a better view of the Grand Canyon. And a lot of other people, of course, are thinking the same thing, so it might be worth the economic cost of strapping some additional emission controls on that power plant close to the Grand Canyon. Okay, so I've been standing next to this thing the whole time. You think, well, why is he standing next to this easel? Well, the reason is because one of the things that I want to do today, and it's the last thing that I want to do in this first video, so if you want to come back to it another time, you just fast forward yourself towards the end of it and say, I better refresh my memory on this basic stuff about how to think about models. Graphs are very simple models, two-dimensional models, relating something on the y-axis to something on the x-axis, so that you definitely want to do that. And for some of you, it'll be, you'll go, wait a minute, this is Eco 4273. That means I had to at least have had microeconomics as a prerequisite. I saw all of this stuff in there. Well, you've got to go through it at least once, because one of the things that I'm doing here is kind of synchronizing some terminology that may have differed from the different places that each of you pointing around like I'm in a classroom, because it makes it easier for me to talk, pretend there's an audience. But each of you watching this video may have had microeconomics from a different source. And so you may have talked about some of these key concepts in a different way, and so now we're going to just synchronize our terminology. So some of you, it'll be kind of a yawner to go through this, and it'll be just a matter of synchronizing the terminology. For the rest of you, especially some of you, bless you, that you're not economics majors, but you want to know about environmental and natural resource economics, this is fundamental stuff, and you better come back to it a few times, because otherwise you're going to struggle later in this course if you don't really pay close attention and come back to this another time. So give me a second, and I'm doing this thing from this fragile easel, and I don't want it to fall off. Boy, talking about fundamental, we want to make sure we understand this notion of marginal benefit and marginal cost. You'll see this graph a lot. Where does it come from? Why do marginal benefits typically, all the times that I'm going to use it, and almost always in the real world, go from being high when the quantity is zero to hitting zero at some quantity later on? And why do marginal costs sometimes start at zero at the origin? The first increment of whatever this good is a marginal cost of close to zero, and then opportunity costs per additional unit of the good. Go. Why does it look like that? Well, this graph, the bottom one, and what you can see now, you can see there's another graph down here. I don't want to distract you, so I'm covering it now. But the graph right here, the lower one, and what you can see now, arises from this graph. Okay, the way that total benefits typically change with quantity, and the way that total costs typically behave with quantity yields this situation. And see, the reason that we like where MB equals MC, marginal benefit equals marginal cost, an optimum Q star, the reason for that is because increasing quantity, as long as additional benefits, a synonym for marginal benefit, is more than additional cost, a synonym for marginal cost, Increase in quantity, as long as additional benefits more than additional cost, increases net benefit. Okay? So as long as additional benefit equals additional, keep going. Stop. You've maxed out net benefits when the last unit, okay, let's say this is 100, the 100th unit increases benefits just barely enough to offset the opportunities. It means you don't want to go to 101. Right? The 101st one, the additional cost, opportunity cost of the 101st one, going from 100 to 101, is more than the change in benefits that we get from going 100 to 101. Okay? So the best increment of output is the first one. But the amount that's perfect, that's best, is the amount that exhausts the opportunity to improve the net benefits. Okay? All the units of output that increase benefits more than costs should be produced. All right, so again, back to the two graphs and how the one comes from the other one. Okay? Most things in the real world, the total benefit derived from having more bananas or apples or trips to the ski area, whatever, goods, services, the total benefit rises at a decreasing rate, and at some point you reach satiation to where, as nice as this was when I hadn't done any, let's say it's ski trips. If you haven't been skiing in a long time and you like to ski, wow, that first day on the slopes is just awesome, assuming the weather's good and the snow's good and everything. Okay, all else equal, we economists say that a lot. Now let's say you've been skiing every day for the last 30. And never mind that you might be getting wobbly and tired or whatever. Assume that you're just as physically fit after the first as you were on the first day. But by golly, it's time to think about some other things. And you miss working. Maybe you're like me and you like your work. And so you're thinking, another day on the slopes comes at the expense of doing some of this work that I like. And by the way, it pays. That's cool. Or some other recreation you'd like, say, another day on the slopes comes at the cost of being out scuba diving. Okay, not right there, of course, because the snow is kind of cold. Anyways, but scuba diving someplace else where you can jump in the water. And you're thinking, I'd rather be scuba diving now that I've 30 days straight of skiing than in having a 31st day of skiing. You may have actually reached that conclusion before you got to 30 days. But at the end of 30 days, you'd probably rather do almost anything rather than one more day of skiing. Although when you had 0 days of skiing, you'd almost rather do skiing than any other use of it, which is why you packed your bags and headed for the slopes. All right, so the benefit increases at a decreasing rate, eventually hitting 0. The change in the benefits, right, flat lines, which means the change in the benefits hits 0. Conversely, what you give up to consume more of the good tends to get larger and larger, and the change in the total cost tends to get higher and higher and higher. Okay, so the marginal cost goes from you're not giving up very much to, wow, another unit of that is going to be really costly. But let's just take another cut at it. When you haven't, like the skiing, if you haven't done it in a while, the first unit is worth a lot. If you've done it a lot, the next unit of it isn't worth very much. All right, so I think I doubled down on that, but that's okay. All right, so again, some of you are going, we covered that, your economics majors. You covered that in micro principles, and that may have been a long time ago, but you covered it in a bunch of other courses. So, okay, fine. All right, so let's pull this thing out of the way. Let me be careful so I don't knock down my whole easel here. It turns out that graphs that depict markets are just based on this in-between graph. Okay, so demand is based on an aggregation of individual folks' marginal benefits. And market supply is an aggregation of producers' marginal costs of increasing production. Okay, so the amount that each decision maker, typically individual people, decides is the optimum for them is aggregated in markets into an equilibrium. I'm sure you can tell that this is a little e, into an equilibrium quantity, which means it happens naturally, okay, on its own, without any government compulsion or regulation. This is a natural, free market outcome. Whoops. free market outcome. Okay, so the free market outcome maximizes gains from trade. In other words, by producing this quantity, we have produced every unit of output that is worth more to somebody than the opportunity cost of making it. And again, depending on how big these look to you, I've labeled this point A, B, and C. Area A, B, C. If you take that area, right, that's the gains from trade, and ABC is the maximum gains from trade possible in the market for this particular good. If for some reason we produce more, this is Q wrong, and in the course we'll get to reasons how that might happen. If we, for some reason, produce more than Q sub E, where the marginal benefit equals marginal cost, hopefully to society as well as to individuals. Again, that doesn't always happen. Most markets it does, but not always in all. For some reason we go beyond that. We've diminished the gains from trade by producing some units of output for whom the opportunity cost is more than the value of the additional output. So we incur a deadweight loss. We diminish the gains from trade that we would have had if we had just stopped here. Now, sometimes the gains from trade are too small because we stop short of Q sub E. But more common for our course, environmental, is we overproduce because the price doesn't take into account all of the costs of producing or consuming the good, and therefore it yields overproduction and a deadweight loss. So we can quantify, in terms of a deadweight loss, this failure to have the quantity be this, Q sub E, instead of Q sub wrong. Okay. Let me shift over to my next graph, and this will bring us pretty close to the close of this individual video. In some cases, okay, for example, emissions, okay, the marginal social cost, let me just briefly go back to here. The marginal social cost of a good would be more than the marginal private cost. Okay, so the equilibrium will not be the optimum. Using the same concepts, getting us used to the hieroglyphics, all this alphabet soup, the hieroglyphics, the gobbledygook, as some of you are maybe are saying to yourself. Sorry, you've got to get used to it. If we apply the same thing to some natural resources, to many natural resources, many renewable natural resources, we get a model that looks like this. Up to a point, the quantity used is sustainable, which means can be repeated time after time after time. If we go out and allow a certain amount of hunting of, say, deer, up to a certain point, we can hunt that amount of deer every year because it's about the same amount of deer that will be born and grow to maturity. But if for some reason we allow the quantity to go past this, now we get into where the marginal cost is more than just the cost of removing the resource and putting it into use. That's the basis here. Now, in addition to that, now the cost, the marginal social cost, includes depleting the stock of the resource, having less in future time periods. Right? So up to a point, the marginal social cost and the marginal private cost can be the same. And so the equilibrium then would equal the optimum. But if we, for some reason, go beyond that, now the resource use is not sustainable at the current level any longer. We're depleting the stock of the resource, the ability of it to replenish itself. The marginal social cost is more than the marginal private cost. Okay, all right, so here's that. I went back to this graph over here, and I said, what if we have emissions and margin? Okay, well, by golly, I forgot I drew this graph, and here it is. Okay, so for some goods, the marginal social cost, like let's say steel, okay, picture a steel mill in your brain. Big smokestacks, right, is the visual image that you come to. Stuff coming out of those smokestacks. Sometimes you can't even see it, but it still could be bad. Okay, so for any given quantity, I just picked this one, the marginal cost to society, everybody, is more than the marginal cost incurred by the actual producer of the steel. And if sold in a free market, it would be more than the cost incurred by selling the good by the consumer of the resource. Okay, so Q sub E is uneconomically large. Right? A deadweight loss occurs by having the equilibrium be more than Q star. In the absence of some corrective policy, the equilibrium will be larger than the social optimum because marginal social cost is more than marginal private cost. Then the issue is, well, what should we do about it? And we'll spend a week or two, at least, I think, at least a week or two in the next few weeks discussing all of the policy options that differ in their advantages and disadvantages and how to bring Q sub E to Q sub star. In other words, we want the equilibrium outcome of people making decisions with freedom, but with complete prices, right? Prices that account for all the costs to be at Q star rather than at Q sub E. Okay, let's take just one more set of examples before we conclude this item. Again, I want all of the graphs to be at the beginning of this first video to start your semester. So let's just take an example of trash disposal. And we'll learn a few other things because we'll learn there's a good reason that it's priced the way it is. That doesn't mean it's the price the way it should be, that there aren't advantages and disadvantages. But there's a good reason for the problems that we're going to describe here and maybe other ways of pricing trash disposal. It doesn't say trash disposal here anyway. This is an example that could be thought of to be X. This is an example that we can use this model to describe. Okay, so trash disposal is a service. You put your trash receptacles out weekly or twice a week, and the city or a private hauler comes by and picks it up. In most places, you pay a monthly flat fee for access to that service. Okay? And by the way, this model applies to anything that's either sold on you don't pay any more or less depending on quantity, or it's paid for by a third party like taxpayers or insurance companies or private foundation or somebody. The model applies to all of these things. And I'm not sure whether you can read this, but what it says is, if you think it's expensive now, or you think it's expensive now, ... wait till it's free. You have to think about that as we go over this. Okay, so back to the trash disposal. We have flat, free pricing of access to that service in most places, which means every month your bill for that service is $20, whatever it is. I've lost track of what it is in San Antonio. But it's going to be $20 whether you're on vacation the whole month and don't put any trash out for pickup, or whether it's right after all the leaves have fallen and you put out the maximum number of receptacles every single time, and they're full to the brim with all your trash and your leaves, still $20 a month. Okay, so flat fee or free. My goodness, we got a typo there. Let me go ahead and adjust that. Flat fee or free access. Yep. Okay, so the flat fee for trash disposal, let's say, is $20, and it's that much no matter how much trash you put out within limits described by the law, maybe, or how many trash receptacles they give you to use. All right, because there's no additional cost for putting out additional trash, okay, here's the quantity demanded down here. Okay, I'll go ahead and mark that on there. Don't draw sideways all that well. And since I'm not using a marker, you may be able to read it. It says Q sub D. All right, so that's the quantity. You're thinking, here's where the lines intersect. Isn't that Q sub D, Doc? We wish it was, right? Because that's the optimum, especially if this is marginal social benefit and marginal social cost. But no, if we price it with a flat fee or free access, which means some third party is paying what it actually costs, this is going to be the quantity demanded. Okay, so think about that. If we had this level of consumption, this shaded area right here would be the total amount spent on this good. If we have this quantity demanded, we have to have this price, call it P with a little apostrophe, P prime we'll call it. We have to have this price in order to have the amount supplied be equal to the amount demanded. And now this whole area is the amount spent on the good. You think it's expensive now, wait till it's free at the margin, okay, a flat fee or free access because somebody is, taxpayers or private provider is paying what it costs. Look at that. This is about 4 times as big as this. Okay, so by making it free at the margin, the consumption level is increased so much that that we're spending an awful lot more on the good. All right, so you're saying, well, Doc, then, well, why do we do this? Why do we ever have flat fee pricing or free access? Well, think of single-payer healthcare. It's the norm over in Europe, and we want everybody to have access and for cost not to be a factor. Well, here's why we have waiting lists for a lot of medical services in a lot of places, is the taxpayers are not willing to tax themselves enough to pay 4 times as much for X as they used to pay when it was privately provided. Okay, or the taxpayers may not be willing to provide this, spend this much on waste disposal service. What do we do then? Well, maybe you should charge a price, call it P double prime, which is charged by volume of trash, how many bags are put out, or how much weight the trash is, rather than just say it's $20 no matter what, that it's $1 per pound, some dollar per unit of measure. Okay? Think about that. First of all, think about it a little bit, you can understand why the flat fee pricing, I didn't realize that was going to be a tongue twister, is the norm. Okay? Not the universal norm. There are places that charge per unit, and they do it in certain ways because of the possible problems. Okay, so if you charge by the unit, you've got to have some way of measuring how much trash somebody has got put out so you can charge them the appropriate amount. That takes time. That slows down the trash trucks, at least some. What else does it do? It tells the person with the trash to throw away is, if I get rid of this trash some other way than putting it out on the curb, I could save myself the billing of whatever they do. What if they put it in front of their neighbor's house instead of their house? Yeah. If the neighbor's not looking or they don't like their neighbor or, it's not all that much, there's some temptation there, right? And some of that's going to happen and the neighbor will discover it and they'll get mad. And anyway, more common is if you charge per unit of trash disposal, more common is litter. Right? If I just dump it out in the middle of the night somewhere, I don't have to put it in front of my curb and the city won't charge me to haul it away. Right? And so the city is thinking about all this litter problem and having to weigh or measure it rather than just toss it in the truck, and how much longer it'll take to pick up trash, and therefore they'll need more trucks and more crews and all that costs money. They're thinking of that when they consider this versus that. Okay? So they're doing this. They're thinking, one way has its own set of problems. There'll be more trash to pick up, okay? Versus we'll have to weigh the trash or count bags or something, and we provide an incentive for people to litter or to put trash someplace for pickup other than where they're responsible to pay for it. Okay, and by the way, there are some places that do charge per unit of the trash to pick up. They've decided that the litter isn't that big of a threat, maybe because they live in a big city and so it's easy to catch people littering. And or they've decided that counting bags, that's what they do, isn't all that big of a deal because, hey, we don't really have to count bags when we pick them up. The way to charge for trash is to only pick it up if it's in certain kinds of bags that we can sell. That doesn't cost much of anything, right? These bags that have some emblem on it or some, something printed on them are the only bags that the trucks will pick up. So you got to pay $1 a bag or $2 a bag or whatever. And so what does that cause? That's kind of interesting. People try to figure out how to get more in a bag, right? And yeah, beware of trash compactors, right? The poor trash man is going to break his back picking up the trash bag. So these are all things that have to be thought of in the difference between one policy and the next. And I forgot to cover this graph, and I hope I didn't distract some of you from it. But here's the last issue we're going to consider before we terminate this video, and I can take a break before the next one, and you can take a break of however long you want to before you view the next one. Recycled stuff. You know, where does a lot of that come from? From trash not being thrown away. Aha! Okay, so if we have no additional charge for throwing away more trash, the supply of stuff available to recycle might be less, yes, this shift is reduced supply, than if we charge a price per unit of trash picked up. See, because one alternative to putting trash out for pickup is not littering. Okay? Another alternative is recycle it, right? Make it available to the recyclers, whoever they are. Okay, and then you don't have to pay the trash pickup people to haul it off. Okay, so you see, having this then reduces the supply for pickup. And then there's the lines that I pre-drew on there, MPB and MSB. Why is that? What's going on here? Well, recycling stuff is another way to think of it, is a merit good. It's a merit good. Something that benefits third parties. Okay? In addition to yourself, okay, you may get warm fuzzies for recycling, or you may actually be paid for the recycling, and you may save money on your trash disposal bill. All that's in MPB. But then you save landfill space. You reduce the environmental impacts and the resource depletion effects of mining stuff out of the ground. Instead, you're using recycled stuff. Marginal social benefit is more than marginal private benefit. And so, never mind the S1 on here for a minute, just forget that for the moment. Here would be the equilibrium. Here's the optimum. This graph says that we should consider subsidizing recycling, okay, in order to increase the equilibrium, Q sub E, to the optimum. Okay, we should consider subsidizing it. And I'm sorry, since I'm tall, I'm going to have to write downhill. An obvious conclusion. I almost said the obvious conclusion. I stopped myself. An obvious conclusion that may not always be appropriate is that the per unit subsidy for recycling stuff, like maybe aluminum cans, should be equal to the difference between the MSB, because, right, that'll just shift this to here, and that'll make the equilibrium the optimum. But why might this not be appropriate? Where do you get the money for S? Well, you might have to tax something. If you're taxing a good, that creates a deadweight loss to eliminate this one. That's a DWL there. Right? If we leave things here at Q sub E, and that's the equilibrium rather than that, we incur a deadweight loss from under-producing recycled stuff. Okay? S equals MSB equals MPB. Fixes things in this graph, but it may create a deadweight loss in another graph. Now, the nirvana, the utopia that we might be able to achieve is to come up with the money for S from taxes on bads, like emissions, something that we'll discuss later in the semester. And that'll do it for us for this first video of this semester. There'll be a few more. So efficiency is the main issue that we focus upon. And for efficiency, we have to first outline the choices in terms of which tool we might use, right, to improve or better manage, in this case, subject of our course is environment and natural resources. And once we've laid out the different tools, then we have to ask the ever-present, okay, how much of these tools do we apply? How hard do we lean on these different levers to make improvements, but at a cost? And then we have to do the old two-handed economist thing and say, okay, up to this point, the benefits of leaning a little harder is worth the costs of foregoing other benefits, other uses of resources. And by the way, one of the more important things in this course is the fact that that varies by perspective. In other words, the individual doing this and weighing his or her benefits as they change with quantity, marginal benefits, versus costs as they change with quantity, marginal costs. That can vary for the individual, what they would choose to do, and then aggregated across all individuals, what the equilibrium outcome can be, can quite often, not nearly even a large share of the time, but still quite often, especially in environmental and natural resource decision-making arenas, can yield a different outcome than that which would seem like the social optimum. So you may be used to thinking in terms of marginal benefit versus marginal cost from your other economics courses. Well, in this economics course, we often have to distinguish between marginal social cost and marginal private cost. Differences between those two is the essence of the pollution problems that we will study. There's also, at times, differences between marginal social benefit and marginal private benefit. Because of those differences, good evening. Although I have to tell you, I'm recording this, it's morning, but ours is an evening class, so hey, good evening, I'll have to work. One of the reasons that I'm recording this, the primary reason, is because I want to make sure that no one misses it. And the secondary reason is there's some parts of it, like the basic coping with graphs, that I want you to be able to go back to as you discover that you are struggling with the abstract reasoning and modeling that we use quite a bit in this course. And so that part will be at the end of this first video. You'll be able to go back to it whenever you want to. All right, so this is environmental and natural resource economics. And a very useful translation of that is that it's price theory applied to natural resource and environmental scarcities. All right, that's the basis of economics is, hey, there's not enough of everything. There's not enough of the things we value the most. They have a lot of different uses. And so when we choose one use over another, we incur opportunity costs, and there are trade-offs. And off we go with our economic tools and how we resolve those to achieve an efficient outcome. And efficiency is not everything, but then once we have the most efficient outcome, then we know what the price tag is for all the other ways that we might manage the resource, our environment, that might forego some efficiency in the name of some other benefit, equity, freedom, redistribution, whatever. We have a price tag then, and we can make an intelligent choice about whether the improvement in these non-efficiency areas is worth the loss in terms of efficiency. All right, so just kind of a reminder to you, which most of you are economics majors, but in case you're not, a reminder that economics is a decision-making science. It's about what constitutes rational decision-making. So at times we encounter irrational decision-making, and we just have to throw up our hands and say, well, economics is not going to help us understand irrational decision-making. Okay, covered in just generic economics courses. What we know, what's so different or special about environmental and natural resource issues? Well, one of the things that makes it indeed worthy and appropriate to have a separate course is that environmental and natural resource economics often deals in very hard to value factors. What do we mean by value? Well, our common denominator of value is the almighty dollar. So sometimes it's hard to put benefits and costs into dollar terms, especially on the benefit side. And by the way, it's important to understand that when we use the term benefit, we mean any impact caused by the decision that we're considering, and so that means it's possible to have negative benefits. We want to relegate the term cost or opportunity cost to just the administration in case of a rule that we're talking about, the administration of the rule and the compliance cost of complying with it, right? Whereas the impacts of complying with the rule, like fewer emissions, but maybe on the downside, the emissions have been changed from gas coming out of a smokestack into a sludge that we dump into the landfill. We have to net out the benefits of transforming the emissions from a gas into some gunk that we deposited right? Because both of them have to be dumped somewhere, which has a cost to the environment. Hopefully, the transformation reduces the cost to the environment. All right, so we have a lot of hard-to-value factors, which makes it challenging to have a benefit-cost analysis of some of the policies and projects that we might consider to manage or enhance the environment or more intelligently use our natural resources. So what do we mean by hard-to-value factors? For example, one of the issues that comes up is prolonging or shortening the average lifespan. Yeah, sure. If we reduce emissions, some people will live longer than they otherwise would have. If we reduce the emissions of some crud, the air will be cleaner. Equilibrium outcomes, the sum total result of people pursuing their self-interest, can differ from the social optimum that would result if all of us sort of collectively decided in a perfect arena, which means not our political arenas, but that's where we make those choices. So sometimes the political arenas produce worse outcomes than the equilibrium. Hopefully we choose wisely and we only try to improve upon things where the political process is likely to yield improvements. All right, backing away from some of that a little bit, let me just introduce myself. I am indeed Dr. Merrifield, Dr. John Merrifield. So make sure you clicked on the right course. You probably did. But that formality, well, it's useful for my paycheck, and it's useful for you to recognize that I am a full-time faculty member, and I have an office here. I'm there all the time, and I have it at utsa.edu email, and I monitor it regularly. All those things are important, but the bottom line is I'm just a regular person that knows a little bit about some things, a little bit more about some things than you do, and so we can interact on an informal basis, and I can appreciate the fact that a lot of things, you know more about them than I do. So feel free to call me by my first name, or if that feels a little bit risque, it's not, but if it feels a little bit risque, call me Doc. That's kind of my preference. So again, I urge you to be in contact through our discussion forums. I'm an email slave. I answer those immediately when I see them, which is often right after you send them. I have office hours, but the official office hours are not nearly all the times when I'm there. If those office hours are not convenient for you, tell me. We'll find a different time to meet. I'm here to serve, and that's part of one of my key guiding principles. Actually, several of them, now that I think about it. Let me just list those, what they are. Truth and labeling. All right? So in other words, I like to call things what they are and not just kind of paper over what they really are to try to be politically correct. We can have direct communication and sometimes agree to disagree and not get our feelings hurt. All right, so guiding principle number one is truth and labeling. Another guiding principle related to what I just said is I try to make a positive difference whenever I am anywhere or doing anything. Okay, that's just part of my wiring. I guess my parents did a good job of raising me because that's what I think about a lot. And so that's part of why I try to be regularly available in all of the electronic forums and come to my office to meet you if you want to meet me at a time that's different than when I'm there automatically in my official office hours. And last but not least, something that some of you might think is an attempt at humor, guiding principle number 3 is that the fun never ends unless you let it. And you think, well, this is serious business. And indeed, serious academics. But we can do serious academics with a sense of humor, and I would argue that when we do, we achieve more of the serious academics than if we just drone on and we try to act really, really serious all the time. People kind of fade out and tune out, which, by the way, is another reason to have this video, is in case you find yourself doing that, you can say, yeah, I just kind of distracted myself, or I tried to do some multitasking because it was on my computer, and I didn't listen carefully enough. But by golly, it's on a video. I can go back to it and listen to it again. So there you go. A way out of some of the downsides of the bad habits that we acquire. All right. So on to some of the fundamentals that will guide us throughout this study of natural resource and environmental economics. First of all, we might ask, well, what's so special, what's different about environmental scarcities or natural resource scarcities that warrants having a special course? Why can't this just be one of the many things that are